O happy day, give with joyfulness, special tears from Terry. Terry's mom's first service in heaven today. I think she still is telling everybody, yeah, but my son did the communion and the offering meditation. And he talked about me, you know. Really special, Terry. Thank you. We need to put Terry in our prayers, don't we, and remember him. Just a special reminder because it fits with our series. Today is the last of 5 in this series, and it concludes next week with the ministry fair. So I'll kind of do a little review, but you're going to love next week's sermon if you like short sermons. But we're going to spend some time with the ministry fair, both at the during the Sunday school hour, and we're going to include it in the worship time. It's going to be a little different kind of a service. So just a reminder of that, and take a look at that insert of yours. And we'll go from there. Well, a couple of centuries back, Jenny and I remember going through that parental phase that comes when your children enter their later teens. Seems like a couple centuries back. The phase that I'm describing is driving instructor. And like many of you, we had our harrowing moments. One of the key lessons, if you are the driving instructor, is in the proper use of rear view mirrors. It mostly consists of convincing your son or your daughter to use them. There's this tendency in young drivers to think they only need to focus on what's in front. Some of us live life that way. We never stop to look back. Now, it's true, you can look back too much. That's just like looking only in the rearview mirror when you drive. However, an occasional glimpse into the past in real life, that's good. Today, what I want to encourage you to do is just that. I want you to look back. I want you to look at past experiences. As we conclude this series on employing our gifts, we've made the point God has shaped, and we've used the word shape as an acronym. God has shaped you and me for ministry. And we looked at the S, that was spiritual gifts. We looked at the H, that was heart. Clay led us through that. We looked at the A, abilities. Look at your abilities. Last week was the P, personality, and how that fits in. And now, finally, today, experience. You see, your ministry is molded by your experience. Terry, you mentioned Hebrews 10, and you quoted some verses out of Hebrews 10. Well, there's another one that he didn't happen to quote, the 32nd verse that says, remember. Remember the earlier days. Your ministry is molded by your experience. And some of those experiences are very positive, and some are very negative. Like J. Andrew Taylor said, some days you're the pigeon, and other days you're the statue. Some are positive, some are negative. Some of our experiences, we can attribute them directly to God at work. Others, we can attribute them directly to Satan at work. Others, we're not sure. They just seem to simply be our own doing. But here's the deal. All of those experiences, God is able to use those to shape you and me for ministry. That's what Max Lucado is emphasizing in the book that we're going through. Cure for the Common Life, he uses this phrase, reading your life backward. Reading your life backward. He says, our past presents our future. He says the oak is inside the acorn. Let me give you just a few other words from Max about reading our lives backwards. He says, go back to your youth. What activity lured you off the gray sidewalk of sameness into an amusement park of sights and sounds and colors? Oh, the fireworks. Every nerve ending buzzed, every brain cell sizzled, all 5 senses kicked in, he says. Now ask yourself this, what were you doing? When all that was taking place inside you, what were you doing? He calls them full flight moments of unclocked time and unlocked energy. All cylinders clicking. Again, he says, what were you doing? Experiences. We're just going to look at a couple of aspects of our experiences, okay? As they relate to our personal ministry. And here's the first. Some experiences, first aspect, some experiences are formational. Some experiences are formational. In other words, that experience actually had a part in forming the specific ministry or ministries that God has picked out for you. When I look at my own life, how did my experiences growing up form me as a preaching minister that also loves music? How did that happen? Well, I was a child preacher. I was one of those that would get behind an end table, literally one of my folks' end tables, and use it for a pulpit so that I could yell at people. It was formational, okay? I'm learning. I remember as a kid holding a tent meeting in my backyard, a revival tent meeting. Invited the kids. We only lasted for one meeting because I told the kids that all of their parents were going to hell if they smoked. Okay, I grew up in kind of a legalistic situation, all right? But you got to start somewhere. And there were role models in my life. I think of those experiences. Even with that old legalistic preacher, I think of some special, warm experiences. And Wayne Thomas was Jenny's and my preacher as we were in high school growing up. And we stayed close to them. And a man named Jim Crane was our youth minister. And Jim took some of the boys out of the youth group that were interested. I was one of them to say, would you like to preach? Are you interested in preaching? And I got that opportunity. I remember my call. Now, in many ways, I think, and this is more important, there's kind of the general call that you sense through your life as different experiences line up. But I can actually point to a time, though I guess you would not consider me real feely in my approach. Still, I can describe a time, a day, a place, an event where I felt very much the touch and the call of God, the call to ministry. Experiences, okay? We're talking about experiences. But enough of me. Let's look in the Bible. This is going to be much more informational, I think, for us and inspirational as we look at formational experiences. How about Moses? Moses was given the ministry of deliverer, right? Deliver the people out of Egypt and into the promised land. And when you look at that story, you see, for instance, in Exodus chapter 2 and verse 10, it says, when the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, I drew him out of the water. The her here is the Egyptian princess. Moses grew up an Egyptian, so much so that later on, here, even in this second chapter, in the 19th verse, they think he is an Egyptian. He looks like one. He dresses like one. He grew up in that way. Why? because there were dozens of times much later on in his life when he would need access to the Egyptian people, specifically to the hierarchy, the royalty that he grew up in. And those customs that he understood that would help him convince Pharaoh to release the Israelites. And even before he got to that point, because you remember he was 80 years old when he started doing that, he spent 40 years, from age 40 to 80, as a shepherd. Why that experience? Why the experience of 40 years as a shepherd? Because he was going to have to lead the flock of Israel and lead them out not only of Egypt, but into a wilderness where they would spend 40 years, the same kind of wilderness that he was in raising sheep for 40 years. Note that the experiences of Moses were formational. How about Joseph? Let's jump back, actually, because if we're on a timeline here, Joseph is before Moses. And what ministry, what ability did he have? Well, among others, he had the ability to administrate. You know, that's one of the gifts that you've seen if you've been taking the inventory. That one of the gifts that's listed in Scripture is the gift of administration. Well, Joseph had that and used that, but it started off with what kind of experiences? Well, how about the dreams? Remember the dreams? He may have wondered, why, like we do, why did I dream that? How often do we wake up, the next morning and say, what the world was that all about? He may have wondered that. After all, his dreams seemed to only get him into trouble. I mean, it was his dreams that got him in trouble with his brothers, and they sold him into slavery. But the dreams and the ability that God gave him to interpret those dreams kept him alive. Kept him alive while he was in prison. And eventually, it all results in his ascension to greatness, where we read that he becomes the second most powerful individual in all of Egypt, second only to Pharaoh himself. Finally, he ends up being the one that keeps his own family alive. His own family being the seeds of a nation, right? What was his dad's name? Jacob. But what was his other name besides Jacob? Israel. Israel. The father of Israel. The 12 sons. 11 of them were his brothers. He keeps them alive. They're starving to death up in Israel. They come down to Egypt. Guess who the dispenser, the administrator, is of the food? It's their brother. Now, they don't know that for some time, do they? So all of that rejection by family and sold into slavery and unjustly accused by guys like Potiphar and being imprisoned, were those just lost years? No. Those were formational experiences. Those were formational experiences. How do we know? Let's take a look. Genesis chapter 50. We're down to the end of that story, right before Joseph dies, actually. And we read in the 20th verse of the 50th chapter, these are his words, Joseph's words. He's talking to his brothers that did all this bad stuff to him. He says, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done in the saving of many lives." Formational experiences. You just see it over and over in Scripture. What about Peter? Peter becomes a courageous evangelist, right? I mean, we see Peter standing up to some very negative, harmful, threatening situations on his very life, and he stands up for Christ. Where did that come from? I mean, what was he first known for? Just the opposite. Just the opposite. He's known for his denials. I don't know the man, he said, and he said it so strongly that he ends up cursing to try to back up the fact that I don't know Jesus, I am not about to stand up for that man. And then he writes, as an old man, these words. This is old Peter now. Do not fear their threats. Do not be frightened. He's writing to people that are being told, stop. Stop this Jesus stuff. Stop believing in him. He says, do not fear their threats. Do not be frightened. And then he says, but in your hearts, revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope you have. Aren't you the guy that was with him? Don't you know him? You look like one of the Galileans. You look like one of the other, followers of Jesus. You, right? Not me. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you. This is the old man now. What a change from Peter the denier. All those experiences in his life that form in Peter the ministry of courageous evangelism. I think about Paul as God was forming in him what you might call pioneer evangelism. Going where no man has gone before. That was Paul as he took the gospel to the non-Jew, the Gentile. Now, his upbringing was very Jewish, of course. We know that. We look at it in Philippians. He describes his upbringing. He says, circumcised on the 8th day of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews. In regard to the law, a Pharisee. As for zeal, I persecuted the church. As for righteousness, based on law, faultless. He just has this amazing list, this amazing pedigree that describes him being such a Jew. But God was actually forming him to take the gospel to the non-Jew and to be the gospel trailblazer par excellence. God was preparing him, in fact, at times to be able to confront his own kind and say, look, you're telling me not to go. I'm telling you I'm going. He even stands up to Peter in some of those situations. Now here I think is the catch. Paul is very, very, very much a Jew. But where did he grow up? Saul of what? Tarsus. Where's Tarsus? Well, right now it's about the 4th largest city in Turkey. Millions of people in Tarsus, southern Turkey. Paul's hometown. You could say, all Roman. Romans had taken it over. And the Romans allowed the people of that city to become Roman citizens. So here you got Paul with this great Jewish pedigree. And God puts him in Tarsus where he learns to live with Gentiles. And God says, now you're ready to be the one that takes the gospel to the Gentiles. And you'll be able to deal with those ankle biters that are chasing you down all the time from the Jewish side. What about Timothy? Timothy, the formation of the ministry of preaching and teaching in Timothy. We know him as the pastor there in the city of Ephesus, among other places that he ministered, I think. But we read about this guy Timothy in 2 Timothy. How about chapter 1, verse 14? Guard the good deposit that was entrusted in you. Guard it with the help of the Holy Spirit who lives in us. What is Paul saying was entrusted into Timothy? I think he's talking about that ministry. Guard it. Guard it. You've been gifted and you are expected to be a pastor and evangelist in these areas. Guard that. And then we read about his experience down in chapter 3, 2 Timothy. He says, but as for you, Timothy, continue in what you have learned and have become convinced of, because you know those from whom you learned it. He's hearkening to his past. And how from infancy you have known the Holy Scriptures, which are able to make you wise. Now see, from infancy, we've got Timothy being brought up in the Word so that one day he can be one who teaches and preaches the Word formational experiences. Don't waste your experience, especially the negative ones, especially the ones that you consider painful. Don't waste them. Your ministry is molded by your experience, formational. Second aspect. Some experiences are functional. Formational, functional. Functional. They provide actual opportunities to do your ministry. God gave me opportunities. I remember, like I mentioned to you, those 3 young guys as we started out with how to put the sermon together. We got a chance to preach for our home church. My first sermon was like 10 minutes long. You said, "You've only digressed since then." And after that, I had opportunities to preach in surrounding churches. You know, preacher be on vacation, and my youth minister would say, "Hey, I got a kid that can preach for you." So my mommy would drive me because I only had my permit, you know. She'd drive me, or my dad, to the church, and I'd preach. And I remember those early opportunities. And then, of course, during my teens, I developed the great interest in and the love for gospel music. And right there in the high school group that we had, we put together a quartet. We were not any good, but we thought we were. And so people would let us sing and put up with us. And we went to college and continued to sing, and eventually an opportunity to sing professionally. But all of that provided both musical and preaching opportunities early on. Early experiences, functional, to actually give it a shot. Yeah, that's one of the best ways to know, isn't it? Whether or not a particular ministry is yours. It's never a sin just to serve, just to jump into a ministry and try. Nothing wrong with that. That's a great heart. That's what God wants us to have. But once in a while, we happen to land the round peg in the round hole, and we say, "Hey, a fit, an area that is functional for me." Again, if you look at Moses as the gift of deliverer, do we see any examples where actually he becomes a deliverer in function? Sure. We mentioned this second chapter here in Exodus. In the 12th verse is the story where he delivers an Israelite from what? An unfair beating. He sees that man being beaten, and he actually kills the Egyptian. He kills the abuser and buries him. The deliverer in Moses. And you know, there's just a few verses later in this same chapter that it says that Moses comes upon a watering hole where he sees some men taking advantage of some other women. All of them were sisters. And again, something in Moses says, this isn't right. And the rescuer steps in, and he rescues those women. Later on, he marries one of them, Zipporah. What's happening? The very, very experiences that he's having are preparing him to be not just a deliverer of an individual or of a group of women, but millions. The entire nation of Israel. How about the one who took over from Moses? How about Joshua? You know, Joshua had the gift of faith and vision, didn't he? He was able to lead them into the land of the Canaanites, and when their fears just were about to overtake them, Joshua was the one that would step up and say, "Hey, we can do this. We can do this." Where did that come from? What would assure him that he was truly gifted and that he could lead in this area, especially when the people rebelled and when they were faithless? I think he'd hearken back to that time when he and the other 11 spies went into the land of Canaan and spied it out. And remember that it was only Joshua and Caleb that came back after that experience and said, "We can do it. We can take it." And the other 10 said, "Nah, we can't." And because the people turned back, at that point, they ended up with just more years of wandering and waiting until finally, only Joshua and Caleb were the two that were allowed to go on a cross and to take the land. And at that point, we see Joshua stepping up, even at the end of his life, and saying, "As for me and my household," can you finish it? Yeah. "We will serve the Lord." Some of you have it probably hanging somewhere on a wall. "As for me and my household, we will serve the Lord." There's that vision. There's that faith in Joshua. And, we mentioned Paul, who's got this gift of being a pioneer evangelist. When you look at some of his arrests and imprisonment and trials, almost every one of them were functional because they allowed him an opportunity to actually exercise the gift. He's arrested by soldiers and guards. He just shares the gospel with them. And later on writes, the whole palace guard is hearing about Christ and coming to him. He gets hauled into court. He just talks about Jesus, about his experience. And they say to him, "Oh, Paul, you're trying to convert us." And some of them were converted. And some of them were not. But all were opportunities to function and share his gift. And I think that's why Paul says, and we read it not long ago because, we went through the book of Philippians. I think that's why he says in Philippians 1:12, "Now I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me," and he's talking about all the bad stuff, "what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel." There you go. The pioneer evangelist speaks again. So here's the deal. Don't ignore the rearview mirror. Don't stop occasionally looking back and learning. Use that. Build upon that. I'll bet you John has shared this with you all before because it's kind of a favorite of preachers. The old mule fell into the farmer's dry well. And the farmer, he cared about the mule, I guess, but he decided that mule nor the well were worth the trouble that it would take to save them. And so he just called his neighbors together and enlisted them to help haul dirt, to help bury the old mule in the well and put it out of its misery. And initially, the old mule was hysterical. But then a thought struck him. It dawned on him that every time a shovel load of dirt landed on his back, he should shake it off and step up. Shake it off and step up. And this is what he did. Clod after clod. Shake it off, step up. And he repeated that, encouraging himself. He fought the panic. And finally, battered and exhausted, the mule stepped triumphantly over the wall of the well. Shake it off and step up. Don't let your past bury you. Don't let your past bury you. Build on it. That's what we're talking about as we look into our lives and we say, "Lord, did you give me some kind of gift, some kind of special ability that came from your Holy Spirit? Maybe I was born with it, Lord, but I never gave it to you until I came to you. And now it's holy because it's given to him to use. Lord, is there something I might find at next week's ministry fair that actually might be something you've called me to do? Or here's something even better. I'd love to hear this. Yeah, I came to that ministry fair, and it was great. But God showed me during the week a ministry he's got me involved in that's outside these walls. Because we are the salt and the light, and that's where real ministry expands and unfolds and glorifies God. Let's stand together. Let's not be afraid to take a look back, knowing that it's all in his hands. Every piece of it, every bit of it, it's all in his hands, and he's been working on us all along. If you need to make a decision for Christ, we always give you that chance while we stand and sing, but it's not limited to that. We just want to remind you, everybody needs to say yes, needs to respond. to Christ. And then beyond that, maybe just you've got a situation today that needs somebody's prayers.